Speaking next is Ed Hartwick. Ed Hartwick is the MDSS coordinator for the Surveillance and Infection Disease Epidemiology section at the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. He handles project coordination and technical support for the Michigan Disease Surveillance System, as well as informatics support for several other projects within the department. Mr. Hartwick has a master's degree from Michigan State University in Geographic Information Science and has been with MDHHS since 2006. I first started working with Ed in 2014. And at the time, I had everybody at MiHIN convinced that I was a troubleshooting genius because I said, if the facility ID has a letter in it, contact Ed. Because the MDSS CLIA ID is the only one that had letters in it, and I knew that. So let's give a warm welcome to Ed.
Well, good morning, everybody. Okay, I'm not as tall as Michael, so I'll log into my machine here so that I can kind of follow along with the presentation that I'm going to give you guys. I'll say pretty early on, our experience with Salesforce is relatively new, and I was going to guess that probably there's a good chance that very few people in the audience might have an idea of what we do, and that's a good foundation of why we need to use a set of trigger codes and why Salesforce would come into play there. And I thought, well, I need something to kind of extend this presentation as well anyway, because otherwise it might be a little short. But then I mentioned that to a friend of mine, and he said, well, they picked the right person, Ed, because anybody who can turn a 15-minute presentation into a 30-one is you. And I said, thanks, I appreciate the vote of confidence. So this morning we're going to talk about basically reportable conditions in the state, then the trigger codes and electronic case reporting. So kind of what we need to do here first is look at kind of the history, and I almost call it the future history of what we're doing here. So kind of the past and maybe a little bit future here as well. What is the Michigan Disease Surveillance System, and what is disease surveillance in general? Kind of the progression into our use of electronic labs, and then just as a natural leap into ECR, the Digital Bridge Project, and kind of the use of a lot of these things here. So we'll start with the Michigan Disease Surveillance System. The Michigan Disease Surveillance System is a primary surveillance system for reportable conditions in the state. And that statement on its own might be a bit intimidating. Reportable conditions are basically conditions that when a physician sees them or a lab discovers them, they should be reported to the state. There's about 80 of them in the state. We're ranging stuff from, say like your foodborne stuff like salmonella to STDs like chlamydia and syphilis, HIV and the like. All these end up having to be reported to us in order to investigate and then follow up on and kind of prevent any further spread of them. The way I always kind of looked at it, it's like when somebody says, oh well, the health department says that we have a huge outbreak of hepatitis A going on, which in fact we do. They said, well, how do you know that? Well, our system is the one that contains the information about those. So it's a centralized web system. It's used for reporting to the state and the local health departments. Because it is centralized between both the state and the local health departments, it basically makes instantaneous reporting to both. Locals are able to see their cases, the state's able to follow up as needed or as invited. And then when investigations are completed, case counts are then shipped off to the feds so that CDC can say, oh, well, things are looking good here, there, and the like. We began receiving messages for this, for the MDSS electronically in 2004, starting with the state lab. We always kind of like to consider ourselves a bleeding edge of a lot of things in here, and so electronic message-wise, this was pretty early, and we've been pushing ever since with that. A good portion of that is because timeliness is key. We have a web interface to have providers and local health enter cases, as you say, if they're faxed to them, or if the providers have a login, they can go ahead and enter the cases themselves. But reporting to the state or to the local health department is required within 24 hours of discovery. So obviously this timeliness is very important because follow-up to a public health emergency is very important. So basically, the more that we could do electronically and automated, the less burden there is on the people doing the work. So with that, cases inside the system are created using common elements and then also more disease-specific elements. And I'll be getting into that in the next couple of slides here. So, all right. So this is kind of the screenshot of the meat and bones of the MDSS itself. The system itself is pretty wide-ranging, has a lot of functions, but when it comes down to it, really what you're looking for is follow-up on an individual case, being able to track a lot of things here. This is really the common reporting interface here. We have the name, demographics, referring information, the lab reports that come in, any notes that are wanted to be kept on the case itself. And these are all items that are common to every single case that would be coming in. The next portion is what we call the case report form. Now, this is the more detailed and disease-specific portion of the system, where a lot of the questions that you would be asking for a salmonella case, like a 5-year or 5-day food history, isn't really relevant to, say, a case of the flu, because you didn't get the flu from eating bad beef. So, and so here we have a lot of the more important questions. I don't take a look to see how well we can see them up here, but you have like say up towards the top, did the person die from hepatitis A? Because this is part of the same hepatitis A form we were just looking at. The symptoms are specific to the condition itself. You're looking at vaccine history, very at the bottom there, whether the person had been vaccinated against Hep A, that kind of business. And so you'd see this in Hep A and not necessarily in anything else. A lot of the disease groups themselves often kind of pattern each other. So this seems kind of like, well, why is he telling me all this? I do have a plan in all of this here. So, so first we'll look at the electronic labs themselves. So the electronic laboratory report is just that. Somebody goes and has a laboratory test run, comes back positive for a communicable disease that's reportable. They send it off to us. Like I mentioned before, we started receiving these in 2004 from the state lab, but really the HITECH Act and the ACA really expanded the use of these things. We started out really with the state lab, and then we had a lot of the major national labs like your Quest, the LabCorp, Mayo. Those guys were early adopters as well, because they had the infrastructure set up and they had a reason to report, because they're reporting all across the country. It's a big burden on them. Having this automated system would alleviate a lot of that issue. With HITECH and ACA, though, you see the expansion into hospitals, because all of a sudden their ability to report electronic labs is now tied to their Medicaid funding. So basically, I should have thrown in some stat slides on this. I thought it have always been kind of interesting, but I can kind of quote a few off the top of my head. Right around 2008, 2009, we were receiving maybe 40,000 electronic lab reports per year. This last year, we received over 175,000 inside of a single year. And a lot of that has been due to the expansion of electronic health records, electronic laboratory systems, and the standardizations involving in each. So, oh gosh, I'm sitting here on the wrong slide for you guys here. This might be a little more helpful than the previous. So, so yeah, it's been a big boon on that, and we did have that incentive that really kind of pushed that forward. But inside of the ELRs, your name, the information is pretty straightforward. You're looking at name, demographics, the person who is the healthcare provider for the person who get the lab test done, and the place that had done the lab test, and then of course the result. So, which kind of looks a lot like the information we needed here. So you get a lot of information that you need to create a new case, but not a whole lot of information that you'd see in the case report form. So you're looking at you're still looking at a high burden from the local health departments for follow-up. So, and the majority of reports here, the reportables are kind of discovered through a lab result. I mean, it really becomes like, well, I think this might be hepatitis A, but you know it's hepatitis A when the lab comes back for it. So it makes a fast and automated way to come out of the laboratory information system. Though the structure of the message doesn't really lend itself to a whole lot of clinical data, and usually the lab information systems are not really tied in really tight to the EHRs, so they aren't able to pull much information from. So we don't end up really, like I mentioned here, with a whole lot of clinical data. The control of these and the triggering of these messages rely heavily on trigger codes lists. Basically, at the time, of course, this is before a lot of introduction into Salesforce at all or anything similarly, was done through an Excel file called the Reportable Conditions Mapping Table. And that just provided a list of LOINC and SNOMED codes, and LOINC and SNOMED are usually where the code sets determined by ONC to be the ones most useful to labs to determine which ones needed to be sent off. So these trigger code lists would be sent out to the laboratories and said, okay, use what you need out of them. We will be able to receive every single one that you send and code it properly. So moving on to the next. The next progression in all of that is ECR, or electronic case reports. And this is kind of where we will end up in the end as well with talking about the meat and bones of these trigger codes in here. Our first run into ECR was before it was really called ECR. We referred to it as CDA, or the Clinical Document Architecture Documents. We had come up with an idea along with our local health department partners who would begin using EHRs more frequently to try and find a way to reduce the amount of redundant data put in. So they'd have to enter a lot of this data into their local EHRs, then the next thing you know, they have to turn around and copy and paste it all into the MDSS. They said, well, why can't we just electronically send this data up here? So, well, we need to come up with a format to do this. And CDA really lent itself to that. So we started down that and had partnered up with EHR vendor that a lot of the local health departments had used. It was called NetSmart, to really start working on this. And we worked on it, and we had some limited successes, but it's a hard start thing to go when you don't have a whole lot of standards to run off. Then along came the public health platform, which was kind of a national push on this idea, and expanded the idea of using the CDA in this kind of setting, but more from a provider, in this case the local health departments being the providers. So we joined up with that. Well, that eventually changed and morphed into what we call now the digital bridge. It has a lot of the same charges. We're looking at a national organization or collaboration of folks to do that. We'll talk about more of that in a minute. But like I said, the concept here would be to get more clinical data out of an EHR into public health so that we can really fill out the rest of this, or at least start with a better position of these, because a lot of the information in here is inside of an EHR. Not all of it, but a lot of it. So it's like, say, you would possibly have a lot of, say, symptoms and your diagnoses. You probably have you would definitely have information probably about whether the person is still alive. Some lab tests done, what they had come in for in the first place, and probably a good vaccination history as well. But the things that you'd be missing are things that physicians usually don't ask in this kind of case, which is, all right, well, do you have a food history? Do you have a travel history? They're there to really kind of treat you as you're sick and not figure out as much where it came from is how to get you better. Public health's role is really to figure out that aspect, so we have to come back and ask a lot of those questions in the end. But having as much as we can out of the EHR pre-populated into our system really is a benefit, and it saves a lot of time. So we'll move back forward here. So we'll talk about the digital bridge here a little bit. The digital bridge, as I mentioned, is kind of a collaboration between several different groups. We have the CDC, we have the Association of Public Health Laboratories, which is APHL, several EHR vendors, including the one we'd been working with. There had also been a couple of national ones. I believe Cerner and Epic have really pushed into this. Public health administrations, which is the PHAs up there, and of course the healthcare providers, because you have to have some place for all this information to start. So the idea is that the initial electronic case reporter, or EICR, would be triggered at the EHR level, then routed through a national kind of decision-making intermediary that's hosted at APHL. It's called the RCKMS. I really wish I could remember exactly what that acronym stands for, but it's really been so long since I've used the whole term. We just call it RCKMS. And then it's referred to from there, because it's a decision support thing. It says, well, is this considered reportable in Michigan? Yes, it is. It moves it off to us. If it's not, then it kicks back a message saying it's not. And of course, since this was kind of a pilot project and we had signed up for, we were only really looking at 5 conditions: Salmonella, chlamydia, gonorrhea, pertussis, and Zika. Zika being, especially last year and the year before, kind of the emerging public health threat. And so of these inside of our area, since we'd be looking at still at the sending from the local public health, chlamydia and gonorrhea and pertussis were really the ones that the local health clinics would be dealing with, because a lot of times you're dealing with local STD clinics, pertussis being whooping cough. This is a big problem in some areas as well. So we partnered with MiHIN and NetSmart and had kind of proposed 2 projects. One where the ECR was generated originally from the EHR at the local health department, and one where it was generated from an existing continuum of care document that is already flowing through MiHIN. And there's some benefits. We'll talk about more from that in a minute. Moving on here. So focusing on the first part of this, the Michigan's digital bridge participation in it, and I've kind of talked about this a bit. It was really looking at the local health departments, moving the data from there. Of course, the aim being to reduce a lot of dual entry going on. The idea here would be that MyInsight, which is the NetSmart product, would create the EICR off of the trigger code list, and then move that through MiHIN up to APHL for evaluation, and then back down to us as necessary. So I have this nice little animation on how that's supposed to work. Let's cross our fingers and make sure see if this is going to work here. So here you have NetSmart, and you have their EICR generated. They say, oh, we've discovered a case of salmonella. Let's send it off to MiHIN. So they send it off to the catcher there at MiHIN. MiHIN takes it, recognizes it as an ECR, and then sends it up to the AIMS platform, which is the host for the RCKMS. At this point, RCKMS does its thing. It thinks about, it goes through a set of rules and decision-making ideas and says, yes, this is a reportable condition in Michigan. We'd better let them know. And so they send the document back to MiHIN and then off to us, where we happily process it and take the information and move forward. The idea with a non-reportable, of course, because every once in a while they'll come across one, they say, oh, this might be a chlamydia case. And they said, okay, we'll send it off to MiHIN and then up to RCKMS. They do their evaluations there, and they said, well, it's missing a couple of key criteria that we need for it to really be considered a case. So we're not going to send it to public health, and we're just going to send a reportability response back to the NetSmart program to let them know that we didn't report it. So, hey, it doesn't count, it doesn't report, Don't look for it in there. So, and of course, okay, here's the last portion of the animation there. So that's kind of the first part of the idea. The second one was and I had kind of mentioned about, was what we call the unified model. And this was kind of initially conceived under the same digital bridge architecture, but instead of starting out at that spot at the beginning at NetSmart, it would be created, the EICR would be created out of the continuing care documents that already flow through MiHIN. The idea being here is that we were looking really for fast onboarding of a lot of these types of things. With electronic lab reports, it's taken us, I think, we've been really working on it since the push from ACA, since probably 2011, and we're still onboarding sites. We figured if we use technology and stuff that's already been being put through, we could start with this and then have the file generation move back to the local EHR as they were made available, as they're able to do it. So of course then we need a place to host these trigger codes at MiHIN because they wouldn't be built into the EHR. We wouldn't be able to use them ourselves, and so that's where the Salesforce product come in handy, where we're going to be hosting these trigger codes. Let's move on to the next, and of course this is kind of another graphic to kind of show how the data flow would usually be on this type of thing. In a traditional concept of electronic case reporting, we'd see, okay, well, they'd send a CCD from the hospital to MiHIN and off to the health insurance. And then we say, well, we need our ECR out of this. So they create a separate file, create the ECR, send it to MiHIN, and then on into us. The idea behind the unified concept, though, is that, well, we don't need necessarily two data streams from there. We can create one data stream that would, to satisfy both, be less work on the front. So the unified model itself, when we started into this with the digital bridge, we had proposed both ideas. After some work and consideration, it really started to look like that, you know, the unified model that we were looking at here wouldn't really fit what the digital bridge was looking for in this kind of thing. So, excuse me. So we decided to take a look at pulling it out of the pilot, but still continuing on with its work. So because of that, we wouldn't have any access to that RCKMS decision-making logic there. So we could still figure that we would be able to move this model on without that decision logic, basically looking just at diagnoses codes coming out of the CCDs. And this also, though, afforded us the opportunity to open up the model to all the conditions out there and not just those 5 that were being evaluated by the RCKMS. So with this model, of course, like I mentioned, we don't have the trigger codes at the EHR. We have them at the HIE. So development doesn't require active participation from the health provider at this point. We could say, you know, you guys are sending these already. Would you like to have MiHIN look at them and send reports to public health? You would really kind of help them out, and you'd serve as, you know, it would serve as a reporting requirement that already exists in public health code. We assume that probably a lot of folks would just be happy to do that because they didn't have to do any work then. Also, though, because they aren't really doing any work, though, it doesn't really count for meaningful use aspects. But really, from that standpoint, if they get up and going with an EHR that can create an EICR on its own, they're welcome to take that back, get credit for meaningful use for it, and then also send the messages the same way. We would just stop scanning their feed for potential reportable conditions. So one of the things, though, this model does require, though, is that HIE hub to act as a transactionary scanner and and have a set of trigger codes that would be able to be updated, refreshed as needed. We do tend to change our reportable conditions about once a year. There's a few added, a few dropped off. So that kind of thing we need to be able to edit and move out and have a central repository for. So moving on. And this is kind of, I may have already kind of previewed this slide in a little bit as well. Really, this is kind of the evaluation of what we had looked at with this expansion of the project, where we don't have to really wait for the hospitals to get up and running with the ability to send, because that was another thing that we were worrying about that we would have to wait on is software updates, changes in vendors, that kind of bit. We would have to wait till people really ramp up EICR. And since it wasn't an actual requirement of meaningful use, they didn't have that same incentive that they had with ELR to get up and going. But we did, we needed the mechanisms to support those whose EHRs, who couldn't yet produce those EHRs but still wanted to participate, because it does leave a lot of, it does take a lot off the plates of the infection control folks at the hospital too, to have this data already put in. The EICR is a subset of the CCD, really. So we already had most of the data that was already there. And when we got looking at it, the majority of the content that we actually needed was already inside of the system as well. So the evaluations that we had of it, everything was looking pretty positive for this idea, this model to really kind of go ahead. And as I mentioned before, if they wanted to send their own EICRs, they could just do it whenever they felt like it, and we would stop doing it for them. So this unified approach, as I mentioned before, I started to become a bit repetitive with this. They can participate now and not the future, and then we really have this place that we need to hold the CCD trigger codes at, which comes into the part about the trigger codes. Everybody's like, well, you're already 18 slides in and you're now getting to the trigger codes, the part that you were advertised to get to. Yes, there's a long run up to this, but trust me, it's useful. So we've worked internally to create this initial set of trigger codes. It's kind of based off of some of the trigger codes that were used in the pilot of 5, and then expand out to pretty much all the conditions that are reportable in Michigan. The codes, as they're discovered and as they're added, would be able to be updated inside of Salesforce. We can upload them in there. We can look at them from a standpoint of, well, ICD-10 codes, because they are ICD-10 codes, they're very hierarchical. So we can look at just the hierarchy that we need. They basically hit an asterisk at the end, and we can get all the ones underneath it, so we don't need to detail every single ICD-10 code that's out there, just the groups of them that we need. This is very helpful for us because at that point, MiHIN can tap into the same data that we have. If you have it set up as a service, you could probably have a lot of the folks out there who are looking at a hospital level to try and run EICR tap into this kind of thing too. And you would know that since this is the same data set that we're using internally back inside the state, you're probably going to be catching the majority of what we figure they're going to have. So, and of course, though, because we were looking at this initially from a nationwide standpoint of a whole larger process, a nationwide trigger code set. All right, slow down. Would be the preferable way of doing this, but really that's because you want to make sure that your hospital systems in Michigan are compatible with your hospital systems in Ohio and Florida and wherever else the people from here go. But since we are kind of ahead of the curve on that right now, looking at all the conditions are reportable here instead of just the 5, we needed to kind of move ahead with that. And when they come out with a national trigger code system set for pretty much everything in the country that would be reportable, then we can just take that and add that into the same kind of architecture here. So that's really going to be helpful for us there. So of course, then I kind of also wanted to describe how we create these things a little bit. We won't really get too into the weeds on it, but basically the systems at MiHIN would check the CCD against the list of trigger codes in Salesforce. The initial match would tell us that it has a potential to be a reportable condition. It doesn't know for sure, but hey, this has already been flagged as an ICD-10 code that we're interested in. So let's create an EICR out of this information that's here, convert the relevant information, generate a reportable response that head back to the vendor that had initially sent the CCD, so they're aware that they have a condition that's been reported to us, and of course route that information off to us. Now, because we are missing a lot of that decision support logic that we had out of RCKMS, I'm trying to think of a really good example here that would work with it. So say if you have a positive lab for something, or somebody thinks that it might be pertussis. Well, it could be pertussis, or whooping cough. So this would match that ICD-10 code and just send it to us. But say for us to really be considered reportable, we need either the person to have been having a really hard whooping cough itself for the last 2 weeks, or another type of symptom on there, say a fever as well. And we wouldn't be able to detect that out of the simple matching of just the ICD-10 codes unless they happen to have those in there as well. So what we'd be looking for is the secondary match, the complex matching that would be done off of a verification system, which would work like the RCKMS, or if the RCKMS was available for us to send in to have it evaluated too, that could be done there as well. That secondary support would make weeding out cases that didn't fit all of the symptoms needed a lot easier, therefore lessening the burden on public health. But and in the way we are doing right now with electronic labs, a lot of times we'll get labs that would end up being considered not a case because it's just, oh, well, this one shows that the person had this condition a while ago. They don't really have it anymore. So that's really where a lot of that would kind of come through. So, and of course, you got to have these awesome graphics with the flow here, because I'm sure my descriptions are lacking in some point here. So with a simple match, basically you start with your EHR, and this is, I'm going to create an EICR because I think I found something that is reportable based on our trigger codes. It sends it off to this fellow here, who then puts it into MiHIN. They match it. They said, yep, that is a condition that we want to send on just based on the ICD-10 codes. And then reply any of the rules that we have to send back to the folks to say, yep, we reported it to the state, and then report it off to the state. With a CCD submission, you're looking at a pretty much kind of the same flow here. This one is one of these, well, this person has been discharged from the hospital. Let's let the insurance company know. It comes in here, and now the MiHIN takes a look at it and says, oh, yeah, well, this also happens to be a reportable condition according to our trigger codes. Let's let the folks know that we reported one and then send it off to the state. And of course, then here's the EICR or the CCD with the complex match, which basically adds that extra verification in there where the system comes up and says, oh, it's a CCD. It's found to be a possible reportable condition. We think based on the trigger codes. Let's check out the verification. What do you know? It fits the symptoms as well, and then we'll move on and send it off to the public health agency as well. So, and of course, with the EICR, I'm not really quite sure if we really needed all the animations in the second one through, but, it's fun. So, at that point, that's pretty much the whole of it, and you kind of see where we're looking at and what we plan on doing, what we'd like to do. So I'm sure I've given a horrible explanation of the whole thing, and you have tons of questions on how this actually works. So I'll open up for questions.
Thank you. I'm Tisha from MPRO, which is Michigan's Quality Improvement Organization. And I just have a quick question. So you talked a lot about hospital reporting for this. Is there any way that this would be open to physician or?
I think so as well. I think we've been really focused on hospitals because really that's where we've been looking at saving a lot of time with infection control there. It could work very well like this in physicians as well, as long as those CCDs are flowing through the system, definitely. I think the other part of it too was that since physicians really aren't part of the meaningful use aspects of this, I think there's a little bit less incentive for them to find a piece of software that would do ECR on its own. So I think it actually might have more benefit for them on that from the stands of reporting. Right. And you know, I think it's definitely something that could be expanded through there. I think the initial works have really been with hospitals. I think mostly because of the fact that they're kind of easier for us to get in communication with, and also to get folks to sign on. And I think when we show some really good successes through there, it'll be easier to come to organizations like MPRO and say, hey, we would like a lot of physicians to take a look at this too. So.
Perfect, thank you.
I must have done better than I thought.
Anybody? All right, let's give that a big hand.
Thanks, everybody.